Hey everyone, welcome back to Quiet Mind. Today we dive into one of the most unsettling ideas in human history, the illusion of free will. The question of whether you truly make your own choices, or if every decision is quietly decided, long before you're even aware of it. Before we begin tonight's journey, take a deep breath. Let your shoulders fall, let your thoughts slow down, just a little. And as you listen, maybe you'll start to notice how your mind begins to wander, softly, like waves touching the shore. Now, here's a question that might bother you more than you expect. Are you really making your own choices? Or are your choices quietly being made for you? I know, that sounds uncomfortable. Because we feel like we choose. You decided to click on this video, right? You decided when to watch it, maybe what drink you're holding, maybe how loud the volume is. Every action feels like your will in motion. But what if I told you? That's only the story your brain tells itself afterward. That by the time you think, I've decided, the decision was already made by patterns, impulses, and invisible influences you don't even see. That's what we're exploring tonight. This might be one of the most unsettling and freeing truths about being human. Because if free will isn't what we think it is, what is it really? And what happens when you realize how much of your life might already be scripted by forces deeper than awareness itself? So, get comfortable. Dim your lights if you can. Maybe you're listening while lying in bed. Maybe just trying to relax before sleep. Wherever you are, this will be a calm dive. No rush, no judgment. We'll take our time unpacking the science, the psychology, and the philosophy behind what we call choice. And if you're new here, welcome to Quiet Mind. We talk about the deep stuff, the things you usually only think about when everything else goes quiet. If you enjoy these late-night explorations into how the mind works, consider following and leaving a like. It helps the channel grow and lets us make more content like this. Now, close your eyes if you'd like, and imagine every decision you've ever made floating before you, like little points of light. Each one feels like it was yours, but as we move deeper, you may start to see faint strings connecting them, subtle forces guiding them, and perhaps you'll begin to sense what those strings really are. Because tonight, we're unraveling one of the oldest illusions in human history, the illusion of free will. If you ask most people whether they have free will, they'll probably laugh a little and say, "Of course I do. It feels obvious. You decide what to eat, who to love, what to wear, where to go. You make hundreds of small decisions every single day, and every one of them seems to come from you. That sense of agency is comforting. It's what makes you feel human, separate from everything else in the world. It gives meaning to effort, to dreams, to mistakes. But when you start looking closer, that feeling begins to unravel. Psychology and neuroscience have spent decades trying to understand how the brain makes a choice, and the more we learn, the stranger it gets. Your brain is a prediction machine. It constantly guesses what you're going to need next based on every experience you've ever had. Before you consciously decide to move your hand, for example, the motor cortex in your brain has already fired a signal to do it. A fraction of a second later, the part of your brain that deals with awareness notices what just happened and quickly tells itself a story. I decided to move my hand. That's the illusion. The decision was made before you arrived to claim it. The conscious mind is less the driver of the car and more the passenger pretending to hold the wheel. You might think, well, maybe that's just about small automatic actions. But it goes deeper. Even the big life-changing decisions, the partner you choose, the job you take, the city you live in, are often the results of complex conditioning. From early childhood, you've been shaped by rewards, fears, memories, and expectations. You internalize your parents' moods, your teachers' values, your culture's definitions of success. By the time you reached adulthood, you were already carrying an invisible script written by millions of moments that told you what to want and what to avoid. When you decided to pursue that career, was it because you freely wanted it, or because you were taught over years of repetition, that this path equals safety and approval. When you fell in love, was it pure choice? Or were you drawn to something familiar, a pattern that echoed an early experience, something your subconscious recognized as home, even if it wasn't healthy? We like to imagine that our choices are born in the moment, but most of them are echoes, reflections of what came before. The psychologist Benjamin Liebert's experiments in the 1980s were among the first to show that neural activity indicating a decision occurs several hundred milliseconds before a person becomes aware of deciding. Later studies extended that window to several seconds. That means that even before your conscious thought forms the words, "I'll do it," your brain has already prepared for action. Think about how strange that is. You live your whole life inside a mind that feels like it's steering, but it's more like watching a movie and believing you're writing the script. The film is already playing. You just keep telling yourself you're the director. But here's the beautiful twist. Even if free will is an illusion, it's a useful one. It gives structure to chaos. It keeps you motivated. The feeling of agency, of being the one who chooses, is what allows you to learn, to take responsibility, to change. Without that story, life might feel like an endless current dragging you along. Philosophers have wrestled with this paradox for centuries. Spinoza argued that we believe ourselves to be free simply because we are unaware of the causes that determine our actions. Nietzsche, on the other hand, saw the denial of free will as a way to free ourselves from guilt, a way to accept life as it is, without blame. And modern neuroscience seems to agree with both. You may not be the author of your choices, but you are the narrator, the one who gives them meaning. Maybe that's why this idea feels so uncomfortable. It doesn't just challenge how you think about decision-making, it touches the foundation of who you think you are. If every "I want" is just a ripple of past experiences, where does you begin? As you lie there listening, maybe you can recall a time you made a choice that felt spontaneous, an impulse, a sudden yes or no. Try to trace it back. Was it really random? Or can you see the invisible line that led to it? A collection of memories, fears, and tiny influences that built up to that exact moment. The mind doesn't like to see the strings, because the illusion of freedom keeps the play going. But if you can look at those strings without fear, if you can watch them move and still stay calm, something changes. You start to see yourself less as a victim of fate and more as an observer of the dance between cause and effect. And that's the space where peace begins, not in control, but in understanding. Because sometimes realizing you're not fully in control is the first real step toward freedom. The hidden machinery behind every choice. If segment 1 peeled back the surface of control, this part opens the machinery itself, the quiet, invisible system that manufactures the feeling of choice. Because every moment you think "I decided," your brain has already been busy, filtering, predicting, and constructing a story so seamlessly that it feels like freedom. But deep beneath that conscious surface lies a network of forces you rarely notice. Habit loops, emotional biases, social conditioning, and biological imperatives that shape not only what you choose, but what options you even see as available. Let's start with something simple: attention. You might believe you're paying attention to the world and then choosing what matters. But cognitive psychology shows the reverse. Your brain decides what to attend to before you're aware of it. 1,000 sensory signals compete every second, and your attention system picks the ones that match your current goals, fears, or emotional state. The rest quietly disappears. So, the first illusion isn't just free will. It's the illusion of complete awareness. You never see the whole world, only the fragments your mind allows. Now, think about how that feeds into decision making. Every choice you make, the person you talk to, the product you buy, the video you click, arises out of what your brain lets through its filters. Those filters were built through repetition and reward. The dopamine circuits in your midbrain fire every time something satisfies a prediction, even if that prediction was unconscious. When you say, "I just felt like doing it," what you often mean is, "My dopamine system registered a familiar pattern and rewarded me before I could question it." That tiny pulse of chemical reinforcement writes habits deeper and deeper until they feel like identity. You don't choose to crave sugar at night. Your neurons learned that sugar equals safety and reward. You don't choose to check your phone when you're anxious. Your mind learned that uncertainty equals discomfort, and scrolling equals relief. Every habit began as an automatic prediction trying to protect you. Eventually, it became a preference, and finally, a choice. But even the idea of preference is slippery. Why do you like what you like? Why do you feel drawn to certain people, aesthetics, or ideas? We tell ourselves stories. "I just have good taste," or "we just clicked." Yet psychologists studying attraction and decision-making find predictable biases underneath. You are statistically more likely to fall in love with someone whose facial symmetry signals health, whose voice tone matches your attachment style, whose scent triggers ancient memories of comfort. You don't decide those things. Your body does. You only explain them afterward, and the explanations feel real. That's the magic. The human brain evolved as a storyteller. It weaves meaning from chaos so you can function. Without that, existence would feel unbearable, a storm of random impulses. So instead, the mind constructs the narrative. "I chose this. I meant this. I am this." That story gives coherence to a process that would otherwise feel mechanical. Even culture plays its role in writing the script of free will. Western societies especially celebrate the individual, the self-made person who chose their path. But anthropologists find that in more collectivist cultures, people describe decisions less in terms of will and more in terms of relationships and harmony. The language of free will itself is cultural. You believe in freedom because you were told you should. From birth, stories, advertising, and even school lessons reinforce that your destiny is yours to command. But look closer. Every time you've been told to be yourself, you were also quietly taught what that self should look like. Think about social media. It's a perfect case study. The algorithm doesn't force you to watch anything. It simply learns what you linger on, then serves you more of it. You feel like you're exploring freely, but the system is teaching your attention what to crave. Over time, it sculpts your perception of what's normal, desirable, or true. And once your perception shifts, your choices follow. You believe you're choosing, but you're actually being trained. This doesn't mean you're powerless. Far from it. Awareness changes the game. The moment you start observing the pattern instead of just living inside it, something subtle shifts. You begin to see how decisions arise, the sensation, the impulse, the justification, and that distance creates a kind of meta-awareness. Meditation traditions have described this for centuries, noticing the thought before you attach to it. That noticing is the closest thing to real freedom we might ever have. But even that, some scientists argue, may be another layer of illusion, the mind observing itself and congratulating itself for noticing, while deeper processes still run the show. The philosopher Daniel Dennett once said that free will isn't about escaping causation. It's about owning your part in it. You are the sum of influences, experiences, and biology, but you can understand that sum. You can work with it. That's where this whole conversation turns from unsettling to empowering. Because understanding how decisions actually form gives you leverage. Once you see how dopamine trains your habits, you can design new triggers. Once you understand that your perception narrows around fear, you can intentionally widen it. Once you realize your emotions bias your choices, you can wait until they settle before deciding. These aren't acts of mystical freedom. They're acts of intelligent participation in your own conditioning. Imagine for a moment standing at a crossroads, two paths ahead, both familiar in their own ways. You might think you're choosing based on reason, but behind that calm analysis, your past experiences are whispering, weighing each option with invisible scales. The one that feels slightly safer, slightly warmer, slightly more rewarding, that's the one that gets chosen. Not because you're weak, but because your nervous system evolved to seek survival, not truth. The great irony is that this system, built to protect you, can also trap you. When every decision is filtered through comfort and prediction, growth becomes the one thing your brain avoids. You can see this in relationships, careers, habits. We repeat what's known because the unknown feels dangerous, even if it's exactly what we need. So the illusion of free will doesn't just trick you into believing you're choosing. It also quietly limits what you dare to choose at all. But recognizing this can be the beginning of something else. Because once you notice the pattern of avoidance, you can consciously lean toward discomfort, the one direction your conditioning resists. And maybe that's where a more authentic kind of choice begins. Not as defiance against the system, but as a conscious dance with it. If every thought and desire is a ripple from the past, then awareness is the still water beneath, the part that notices the ripples without becoming them. You may never control the currents entirely, but you can learn to float differently, to move with intention, even when the tide is inevitable. And perhaps that's the quiet paradox at the center of all this. The freedom to see that you were never free, and to find peace in that seeing. The mind's hidden puppeteer, the unconscious architect of choice. Every thought you have, every decision you believe you've made, begins long before you're aware of it. That's not poetry, it's neuroscience. Researchers at Harvard, at Freiburg, at Stanford have used brain imaging to show that neural patterns predicting your decision appear seconds before you consciously decide. In one study, scientists could tell which button someone would press 7 seconds before the person said they made the choice. 7 seconds. Imagine that. Your brain has already decided, and your awareness simply catches up and claims the decision as its own. What's happening in those 7 seconds? That's the unconscious mind, the vast hidden world beneath the surface of your awareness. It's ancient, automatic, and astonishingly powerful. It pulls data from every past experience, every emotion, every social cue, and runs calculations at speeds consciousness could never reach. Then, like a magician, it delivers the final trick, the feeling of, I decided. Your conscious mind, the narrator of your life, takes that delivery and writes a story around it. I thought about it and I chose this. But in truth, the choice was already made. You're the spokesperson, not the CEO. Think about the last time you said something you didn't plan to say, a moment when words just slipped out. Or when you had a gut feeling about someone you couldn't explain, but it turned out to be right. That's the unconscious at work. It speaks a language older than logic, a language of pattern, intuition, and emotion. And the strangest part, most of the time, it's right. Because your unconscious mind isn't random. It's a living archive, storing everything you've ever seen, felt, or feared. It recognizes subtle cues, micro-expressions, tonal shifts, environmental patterns, and translates them into sensations, into impulses. That sudden urge to leave a room, the inexplicable comfort around a stranger, the decision to turn down a street for no reason. These are the whispers of that hidden system guiding you quietly, efficiently, invisibly. But that same system can be manipulated. That's where free will starts to dissolve again. Advertisers, politicians, and social platforms have learned the grammar of your unconscious, the colors, sounds, and symbols that bypass logic and speak directly to emotion. A flash of red triggers urgency, a slow fade of blue signals trust, the rhythm of speech, the spacing of pauses, even the scent of a room. All of it can prime your decision-making before a single rational thought occurs. You scroll through an ad and think, I like this brand. You have no idea that the font was chosen because it matched the familiarity of your childhood cereal box, or that the music in the background was tuned to a tempo your heart associates with safety. That's not choice. That's conditioning wrapped in aesthetics. And it's not always external manipulation. Sometimes it's your own mind replaying its favorite tricks. When you procrastinate, you think you're choosing to delay. But really, your unconscious is protecting you from perceived failure or rejection. When you overthink, your brain is creating motion to avoid stillness, because stillness might surface discomfort. You're not lazy or indecisive. You're being steered by a deeper system that believes it's keeping you safe. Here's where philosophy meets psychology. If every action is a result of previous causes, biological, emotional, environmental, then where in that chain can free will possibly exist? Some thinkers, like Spinoza, believed freedom lies not in choosing freely, but in understanding necessity. In other words, when you see the strings that move you, you begin to move differently. Not because you've escaped control, but because you finally see it. Awareness becomes the new kind of power. When you realize your mind is a system, you can begin to work with it like one. You can hack your environment, rewrite your triggers, shape your unconscious cues. You can expose yourself to new ideas that slowly shift the biases underneath your habits. The brain is malleable. Neuroplasticity doesn't give you total freedom, but it gives you responsibility. For example, think about how music influences emotion. If you listen to something melancholic, your brain synchronizes to that rhythm. Dopamine and serotonin rebalance, and suddenly your thoughts align with the mood. That's not mystical. That's your limbic system adjusting to stimulus. But knowing that, you can choose what stimulus to feed yourself. That's the real paradox of control. You can't control the machinery, but you can design the inputs. The myth of control. How choice becomes a story. We tell ourselves, let's pause for a second, not to stop, but to look at what's really going on when we say, I'm in control. It's a comforting sentence. It feels powerful, even stabilizing. Like we're steering the ship of our lives through the ocean of chaos. But look closely. What exactly are you steering? Your thoughts? They appear before you notice them. Your emotions? They rise uninvited. Your impulses? They emerge from the same silent machinery that decides before you do. The myth of control is one of the mind's most elegant illusions, and one of the hardest to let go of. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Control is mostly narrative. You don't control events. You interpret them. You don't control feelings. You label and respond to them. What you control, if anything, is the story you tell afterward, the meaning you attach. Something bad happens and you say, "This'll make me stronger." Something beautiful ends and you whisper, "It was meant to be." Those sentences aren't about controlling reality. They're about rewriting your relationship to it. They're how the conscious mind copes with the fact that most of life unfolds without permission. Now, before this sounds too fatalistic, consider the strange paradox. While you can't control the origin of your thoughts, you can influence their trajectory. Once a thought arrives, unbidden, unplanned, what you do next begins to shape your inner world. You can feed it or starve it, nurture it or question it. That's not total freedom, but it's leverage. Think of it like surfing. You can't control the waves, but you can learn how to ride them, how to stay balanced, how to move with rather than against. The ocean doesn't stop for you, and neither does life. But with awareness, with emotional dexterity, you learn to flow instead of drown. That flow, that delicate dance between acceptance and intention, might be the closest thing we ever get to control. Now, imagine your day. You wake up, maybe scroll through your phone before you even realize you've reached for it. You check notifications, messages, news. It feels like you are doing those things. But what's really happening is a sequence of conditioned impulses firing in perfect coordination. The phone's color, its design, the little red badge icons, all of it crafted to trigger dopamine loops, to make choice feel natural when it's anything but. You think you're seeking connection or information, but in reality, your brain's reward system is seeking closure. You scroll not for joy, but for relief. Relief from uncertainty, boredom, or the faint anxiety of stillness. That's control inverted. The system controls the controller, and yet people resist this idea. Because to admit you're not fully in control is to face something deeply uncomfortable, vulnerability. The mind resists that with every fiber of its being. It creates narratives like armor. I know myself. I can change whenever I want. I'm not like everyone else. But every act of resistance reveals the fear underneath. The fear of chaos, of not knowing, of being just another organism in the stream of causality. So, where does that leave us? Maybe control isn't about mastery, but about surrender. Not in a passive sense, but in a conscious one. To surrender doesn't mean to give up. It means to stop pretending that you're the puppeteer when you're really part of the dance. It's about seeing the strings, feeling them, and realizing that even the awareness of being moved is, paradoxically, its own kind of agency. You can see this in meditation, in art, in moments of deep flow. The musician lost in sound, the writer lost in words, the athlete lost in movement. They're not controlling every gesture. They're allowing instinct, intuition, and memory to merge into a seamless rhythm. The more they try to control it consciously, the more it breaks. But when they let go, something else, something beyond deliberate thought, takes over. It's effortless, timeless, almost sacred. And maybe that's what true alignment feels like. Not control, but cooperation. A harmony between conscious intention and unconscious intelligence. Philosophers like Alan Watts described it beautifully, that the sense of being a doer separate from the doing is the core illusion of the ego. You are not the one pushing the river forward. You are the river, already flowing. The effort to dominate your mind, your emotions, your life is like trying to hold water in your fist. The tighter you grip, the less you hold. Now, let's make this more personal. Think of a time when you tried to force something to happen. Maybe a relationship, a job, a decision. You obsessed, you analyzed, you pushed. And somehow, the more effort you poured in, the less aligned it felt. Then, when you finally let go, when you stopped clinging, something shifted. The right words appeared. The right opportunity unfolded. The person you were chasing stopped feeling like a destination, and you simply moved forward. That's not coincidence. That's the physics of psychological surrender. Here's the hidden wisdom. Surrender isn't the opposite of control. It's the evolution of it. It's choosing awareness over illusion. You still participate, but without resistance. You still care, but without attachment. You still choose, but with the humility of knowing the choice chose you first. So, maybe the path to freedom isn't to gain control. It's to understand it's never been yours to begin with. And in that understanding, a strange peace emerges. The kind of peace that doesn't need to grasp, to justify, or to win. It's the quiet realization that you were never behind the wheel, but somehow the car is still moving exactly where it needs to go. The architecture of belief. Why the mind can't stand emptiness. If the myth of control gives us comfort, then belief gives us structure. When the human mind confronts uncertainty, it doesn't just observe, it builds. It fills in gaps with stories, patterns, and meaning, even when none exist. You can see this everywhere, in the way people explain coincidences, justify their emotions, or cling to routines that make life feel predictable. Belief isn't optional. It's the scaffolding that keeps our sense of self from collapsing into the vast unknown. Every decision you make sits on top of a network of invisible assumptions. You might think, I'm doing this because it feels right. But what does right even mean? That word hides an entire architecture of belief about morality, about success, about identity that you inherited from parents, culture, and experience. You didn't choose those foundations consciously. They were placed beneath you before you ever questioned them. The brain abhors uncertainty like the body abhors a vacuum. When something doesn't make sense, the mind rushes to seal the gap with explanation. That's why conspiracy theories, superstitions, or even self-deception can feel comforting. They're not random errors, they're survival mechanisms. It's safer for the mind to believe something, even if it's wrong, than to sit inside the terror of the unknown. This is where the illusion of free will takes its deepest root. Because every choice we make isn't floating freely. It's anchored to a belief system we rarely question. You may think you're acting independently, but if you trace your decision backward, you'll find a chain of influence. Social norms, personal experiences, biological impulses, and inherited ideas. Each one nudges the next, like falling dominoes. It's humbling to realize that even your deepest convictions, political, moral, spiritual, aren't purely yours. They are mosaics built from voices you've heard, books you've read, and moments that shaped your emotional wiring. And yet, these secondhand beliefs feel like truths. The brain doesn't label them as adopted, it labels them as me. Belief then becomes identity's skeleton. Without it, the mind begins to unravel. This is why people cling so fiercely to ideology. It's not just disagreement, it's self-defense. When someone questions your worldview, it's not merely your opinion that feels attacked, it's your very sense of being. You're not arguing ideas, you're protecting your reflection. But here's the paradox. As much as belief sustains us, it also confines us. Each belief you hold creates boundaries of possibility. To believe is to close off the infinite. Once you decide what's true, everything outside that truth becomes invisible. The mind no longer sees the world as it is. It sees what it expects. Think about that for a moment. Every belief acts like a filter on reality. Two people can look at the same event and walk away with opposite conclusions, each completely convinced they have seen the truth. That's because the mind doesn't record reality, it constructs it, and those constructions are guided by the beliefs that lie beneath awareness. So, where does this leave the idea of free will? If our actions arise from beliefs we didn't choose, and those beliefs arise from experiences we didn't design, then freedom becomes something different, something quieter. Maybe freedom isn't about escaping influence, but about seeing it. When you begin to notice the architecture of your own belief system, you create just enough space to question it. And in that moment of awareness, the machinery hesitates. For a brief second, the loop opens. That's the closest thing to free will most of us will ever taste. In psychological terms, this is called metacognition, the ability to think about your own thinking. It's not glamorous, but it's revolutionary. The moment you realize that your mind is spinning stories, you stop being fully trapped inside them. You begin to sense the subtle distinction between you and the narrative voice inside your head. That space, tiny as it may be, is where awakening begins. Not the mystical kind with flashing lights and divine revelations, but the quiet kind. The one that lets you breathe when everything feels chaotic. It's the realization that you don't have to believe every thought, don't have to defend every opinion, don't have to cling to every conclusion. In the end, belief is both a shelter and a cage. The skill lies in knowing when to rest inside it, and when to step outside and face the vast, luminous uncertainty of not knowing. And maybe, just maybe, that's what genuine freedom feels like. The hidden hand. How desire programs. The illusion of choice. Every action begins with a flicker, a pulse of wanting. You feel it before you name it, a slight pull toward the thing, the person, the outcome. It hums under the surface like background static, the silent code that animates behavior. You think you've decided to move, to speak, to chase, to stay. But desire decided first. And the strangest part, you rarely notice. The mind loves to tell stories of logic and reasoning, of weighing pros and cons, of consciously deciding what's best. But behind the curtain of thought, a more ancient mechanism hums along. The limbic system, the reward center, the emotional core. It whispers, and that the prefrontal cortex rushes in to justify the whisper. You don't decide to want something. You realize you already do. Think of how many choices in your life began, not with analysis, but with feeling. The friends you're drawn to, the music you love, the city you move to, the people you trust. The reasoning often comes later, like subtitles added to a movie that's already been filmed. You want, and then you rationalize. You reach, and then you say why. That's not weakness, it's wiring. Human consciousness evolved on top of emotional machinery millions of years older than thought itself. We are storytellers sitting atop instinct. The rational mind is not the driver, it's the narrator. And like any good narrator, it edits, embellishes, and occasionally lies, not to deceive others, but to preserve a fragile sense of agency. So, when you say I chose this, what you really mean is I followed what felt rewarding. Dopamine, that shimmering molecule of motivation, paints your world with invisible arrows, pointing you toward pleasure, novelty, validation, comfort. It tells you, go there, do that, feel this. You follow, thinking you're leading. Now pause for a moment and consider how much of modern life is built around that very mechanism. Apps, ads, products, even social interactions, all designed to trigger desire loops. Each notification a microdose of dopamine, each scroll a chance for reward. It's not manipulation in the sinister sense. It's architecture. The world has learned to speak the brain's native language, craving. And that's why the illusion of free will feels so convincing. Because the system doesn't force you, it invites you. It says, here, choose. But the menu itself was written long before you looked at it. Every option you see, every preference that feels organic, was shaped by a lifetime of conditioning, reward and punishment, attraction and avoidance, pleasure and pain. The loop writes itself, and you live inside its syntax. The philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer once said, "Man can do what he wills, but he cannot will what he wills." You can act on your desires, but you cannot decide which desires arise. That's the trap, and also the truth. You are free only within the boundaries of your programming. Like a song that can improvise, but only in its own key. But here's the subtle twist. Awareness transforms the game. Once you see the loop, once you catch the flicker of wanting before it becomes action, something changes. The desire is still there, but it loses its power to command. You can observe it like weather passing through your internal sky. You feel hunger, but you don't have to eat. You feel loneliness, but you don't have to reach. You feel envy, but you don't have to act. Freedom in this frame isn't control, it's recognition. This awareness doesn't kill desire, it refines it. When you start to see what moves you, you also begin to see what truly nourishes you. Not every craving is hunger, not every attraction is love, not every impulse is intuition. Sometimes the very things that glitter inside the mind are mirages, projections of unmet needs, childhood echoes, or social scripts absorbed without permission. The marketing world knows this better than anyone. They don't sell you a product, they sell you yourself. They show you the version of you that you wish existed, more confident, more beautiful, more in control. You don't buy the thing because it's useful. You buy it because it symbolizes an ideal, a promise of emotional completion. That's not logic, that's longing. Desire is not evil, it's the fuel of creation. Every painting, invention, and love story started as a want. But the problem arises when desire becomes invisible, when you mistake its whisper for your own voice. Then it drives you quietly, shaping every habit, every dream, every definition of happiness. Until one day you realize you've been living someone else's algorithm. The moment you see that, the exact second the curtain pulls back, something astonishing happens. The desire doesn't vanish, but it softens. You're no longer entangled in it. You're watching it dance. And in that gentle space between impulse and action, something new is born. Clarity. Maybe free will doesn't mean changing what you want. Maybe it means understanding why you want it. Because once you see why, the wanting becomes transparent. And in that transparency lies choice. Think about it. Every spiritual tradition, every path to inner peace, has been teaching this same lesson in different languages. Buddhism calls it mindfulness. Stoicism calls it mastery of passions. Psychology calls it cognitive distance. They all point toward the same revelation, that seeing your desires clearly is the first step toward not being enslaved by them. And perhaps that's the quiet revolution. Not to eliminate desire, but to meet it with awareness, to feel its pulse, acknowledge its story, and decide, not react, in its presence. Because the moment you do, the illusion of control becomes less of a lie and more of a metaphor, not for dominance, but for discernment. You stop being dragged. You start moving with intention. And maybe that's all the freedom the human mind ever needed. The mirror of the mind. When choice becomes reflection. It's strange, isn't it? How you can look back on your life and see a trail of decisions that seem spontaneous, random, even chaotic at the time. Yet now, in hindsight, they form a kind of perfect design, almost like something, not someone, was weaving behind your every move. We call it fate when we look backward, and free will when we look forward. But maybe both are just different names for the same mirror, the one your mind holds up to itself every single day. When you think you're deciding, you're really reflecting. Reflecting your history, your fears, your unspoken desires, your learned patterns. Every choice is the echo of something older, something you didn't pick, but that picked you long before you had language for it. You see, the mind isn't a blank screen that options appear upon. It's more like a mirror covered in fingerprints, smudged by memory, tinted by emotion, warped by belief. And when you look into it, what you see isn't reality. It's a reflection of your conditioning, disguised as clarity. So when you say, "I'm choosing this because it feels right," pause for a moment. Ask yourself, does it feel right because it's true or because it's familiar? That question alone can change the course of your life. Because the human brain confuses comfort with correctness. It loves what it recognizes, even if what it recognizes has heard it before. That's why so many people repeat the same emotional loops, chasing partners who resemble old wounds, jobs that recreate childhood pressures, lifestyles that mirror inherited values. It feels safe, even when it's not. Because safety isn't peace, it's predictability. And predictability is the drug the mind craves most. It's not chaos that terrifies us, it's uncertainty. That's why the illusion of free will feels so comforting. It gives you a story, a sequence, a why. But that story is often reverse engineered after the fact. You make a move, and then your mind races to explain why it made sense. Your consciousness is like a narrator chasing a movie that's already playing. But let's turn the mirror slightly, because here's where it gets fascinating. Your reflection isn't just a product of the past. It also bends toward what you believe your future should be. Expectation reshapes perception. When you believe you're the kind of person who always succeeds, you interpret setbacks as stepping stones. When you believe you're unlucky, the same event becomes proof of failure. Reality bends around the story you hold. That's why psychologists talk about confirmation bias. But that term doesn't capture the poetry of what's really happening. It's not just that you seek evidence for what you already think. It's that your entire perceptual world filters through the lens of self-concept. You don't see things as they are, you see them as you are. So, imagine the chain reaction. The self-concept defines expectation. Expectation shapes perception. Perception triggers emotion. Emotion fuels desire. Desire motivates action. Action reinforces the self-concept, and the loop closes. Where in that loop is choice? Nowhere and everywhere. It exists not in the link, but in the awareness of the chain, because awareness is the only thing that stands outside the cycle and can see it for what it is. That's what the mystics and philosophers have been whispering for centuries. That free will isn't about breaking the chain. It's about waking up inside it, to recognize that you are both the dreamer and the dream, the player and the script. When you understand this, something begins to shift. You stop struggling to make the right decision and start listening to what each decision reveals about who you already are. You begin to see patterns as teachers, not prisons. The toxic relationship isn't proof you're broken. It's a mirror reflecting an inner pattern of attachment that's ready to be seen. The job you hate isn't a punishment. It's feedback that your values have evolved, but your environment hasn't caught up yet. And suddenly, what once felt like fate begins to feel like dialogue. Life isn't happening to you, it's conversing with you. Every event, every impulse, every emotion becomes a word in a language you were never taught, but always knew. The question is, are you listening? Because in that listening, in that deep internal stillness, you start to detect something almost mystical. Beneath the noise of preference and habit, there is a quiet witness. A part of you that never reacts, never judges, never interferes. It just sees. That's the real you, not the one who chooses, but the one who observes the choosing. And that witness doesn't live in the past or future. It doesn't care about success or failure. It doesn't crave control because it is control, not through force, but through understanding. It's the stillness beneath the current, the awareness beneath the actor. When you connect with that part, even for a breath, even for a heartbeat, something radical happens. The illusion doesn't disappear, but it loses its gravity. You still play the game of life, but now you know it's a game. You still make choices, but they feel lighter, more fluid, less haunted by what if. And in that state, paradoxically, you begin to experience true freedom. Not the freedom to control every outcome, but the freedom to surrender without fear. Because maybe freedom was never about choosing differently, but about seeing clearly. And clarity is the quiet superpower no illusion can survive. It's like standing before the mirror again, this time not to fix your reflection, but to understand it. To smile at the infinite versions of you that have lived, chosen, loved, and lost. You realize that you are not the reflection. You are the mirror, and the mirror never changes. Only what it reflects does. In that realization, something dissolves. The pressure, the guilt, the endless weighing of options. You breathe deeper. You feel softer. You realize that maybe, just maybe, the point of life was never to decide right, but to see right. And in that vision, lucid, still, vast, the illusion of free will doesn't vanish. It transforms. It becomes art, a dance, a gentle play of consciousness pretending to be human. Because what else could it be? A universe dreaming of itself, through you, through me, through every choice that was never really a choice at all, just a reflection returning home to the mirror that made it. The hidden author. How stories write you before you live them. There's a moment that comes after you've stared into the mirror of your own choices long enough. At first you think you're looking at yourself. Then you realize you're looking at a character that's been written for you. And the deeper you look, the more you begin to see the faint ink of an unseen author running through every page of your life. This is not about fate in the mystical sense. It's about narrative psychology. One of the most underappreciated discoveries of the last 50 years is that the human mind doesn't store reality as facts. It stores it as stories. Before you were able to write your own, other people were writing the first chapters for you. Your parents, your teachers, your culture, your language. You didn't choose your first words. They were given to you. You didn't choose your first moral codes. They were handed to you. And so, when you later decide who you are, you're already deciding inside a story that was drafted long before you picked up a pen. Think about how you explain your day to a friend. You don't give them raw data, timestamps, GPS coordinates, heart rates. You tell them a narrative. This happened, then that happened, and it meant this to me. The brain is a storyteller, and the storyteller's greatest trick is convincing you that you are the author. That's why certain decisions feel almost inevitable, because unconsciously, you are trying to keep your plot consistent. If the story you tell yourself is, "I am always overlooked," you will interpret neutral events as rejection. If the story is, "I'm destined for big things," you will interpret the same events as temporary tests. Your perception, your emotional reactions, even your so-called gut instincts are biased toward protecting the continuity of your narrative self. This is why researchers like Dan McAdams talk about the narrative identity. It's not just a metaphor. It's a structure built in memory, emotion, and imagination. And it shapes what you notice, what you dismiss, and what you move toward. You think you're making a free choice, but very often you're simply picking the next scene that makes the story make sense. Here's where it gets even more subtle. Stories don't just sit in your mind, they run on scripts, social scripts, gender scripts, success scripts. Without realizing it, you've memorized them. You know how to behave on a first date, in a job interview, at a funeral, on social media. Those scripts whisper not only what to do, but what to want. They even whisper what you're allowed to imagine. And if you try to step outside the script, you don't just feel lost, you feel wrong. That uncomfortable feeling is the story fighting back. But there's another layer no one talks about. The meta story, the genre you think your life belongs to. Some people live as if they're in a tragedy. Others, a romance. Others, a redemption arc, a hero's journey, a dark satire. Your genre determines what counts as a plot twist and what counts as an ending. This is why two people can experience the same breakup and one feels destroyed while the other feels liberated. Different genres, different meanings. Now, ask yourself, if your genre is steering your interpretation of every event, how much of your so-called will is actually genre maintenance? When you feel an urge, when you feel an aversion, is it truly yours? Or is it a character trying to stay true to form? And yet, just as a reader can step back from a book and realize it's fiction, you have the ability to step back from your own narrative. That step back is not a thought, it's an experience. It's the quiet moment when you're no longer inside the first-person camera. You're watching the camera move. You're aware of the script. You're aware of the author's hand. In that space, tiny cracks of possibility open. You might notice that you don't have to keep the old story going. You can let a character die. You can end a chapter. You can start a new genre. The mind resists it because change feels like death to the old self. But the awareness that you're in a story is the beginning of freedom. This doesn't mean you'll suddenly control everything, no more than a lucid dreamer controls every pixel of a dream. But like a lucid dreamer, you can influence, you can redirect, you can experiment, you can stop reacting and start composing. And that's the paradox. The moment you see the story loosens its hold. You no longer have to act out the unconscious script to feel safe. Psychologists sometimes call this reauthoring. Philosophers call it self-transcendence. Mystics call it awakening. All are pointing to the same event. The shift from being a character trapped in a plot to being consciousness aware of a plot. And once you've tasted that, every decision starts to feel different. You're not desperately trying to choose right anymore. You're exploring, you're improvising, you're learning how to write in the margins. Even your mistakes feel less like failures and more like drafts. This is the hidden author inside you, not the one who controls every scene, but the one who can change the tone, the pacing, the emphasis. The one who can take a story that was once a prison and turn it into a path. So pause here. Feel the space between the lines of your own life. Notice how much of what you call me is actually a narrative costume. And notice too, the silent presence wearing the costume. That presence doesn't need a story to exist. It doesn't need free will to be free. It just is. From that place, even the illusion of free will becomes a kind of art form, a way of playing with possibility, of weaving meaning into experience, of tasting the strange beauty of being human. And now, let's slip quietly into another layer beneath the story, the part where choice itself begins to dissolve under the microscope. Because once you've seen that your mind runs on stories, the next realization is even stranger. Sometimes the story isn't even written by your conscious thought. It's written by the body, by chemistry, by the intricate machinery that hums below the threshold of awareness. It's almost disorienting to think about. Every decision you've ever made might have been set into motion a few milliseconds before you even felt the spark of, "I decided." The philosopher Daniel Dennett once said that consciousness is not the conductor of the orchestra. It's more like the press agent, taking credit after the music's already started. Neuroscience keeps stumbling into that same unsettling truth. The famous Benjamin Libet experiments, for example, showed that the brain registers a decision up to half a second before the subject becomes consciously aware of making it. Half a second might sound small, but in the theater of thought, it's an eternity. And yet, we live as if the moment we feel like choosing is the very moment the choice is born. The illusion is necessary. It keeps the narrative coherent. It's the same mental sleight of hand that keeps a movie scene smooth, even though it's made of discrete frames. The brain is editing constantly, splicing intention into action so seamlessly that the cut is invisible. When you zoom out and see that process for what it is, the sense of control begins to wobble. But here's the strange relief hidden in that wobble. Realizing you're not as in control as you thought doesn't mean you're powerless. It means the system is bigger, richer, more mysterious than the small voice of I pretending to be captain. Imagine the mind as a city at night. The conscious you is one bright office light in a tall building, but beneath it, millions of unseen rooms are lit. Emotional circuits, habits, sensory memories, evolutionary reflexes. They're processing, deciding, moving long before the office light flicks on. By the time consciousness catches up, the city has already shifted its traffic flow. You simply inherit the direction. It's humbling, but also liberating, because when you stop clinging to the illusion of total authorship, you stop hating yourself for the moments that don't make sense. You stop asking, why did I do that? And start asking, what part of me did that? And why? You move from judgment to curiosity. And in curiosity, there's movement, there's flexibility. That's where real change begins. Every craving, every hesitation, every impulse carries a hidden biography. Maybe that craving for approval started as a survival instinct in childhood. Maybe that hesitation to speak up began the first time silence felt safer. Your choices are the latest translation of ancient emotions. You're not weak for following them. You're human for being written by them. But awareness lets you begin to edit the translation. Take the example of love. You tell yourself you chose to fall for someone, but think about how that process unfolds. It starts with the smell of their skin, the tone of their laugh, the rhythm of their speech, signals absorbed before any conscious judgment forms. Then comes the story your mind builds around those sensations. They're different. We just click. I can be myself with them. You believe those thoughts cause the feelings, but the truth is reversed. The feelings come first. The story arrives to justify them. Love isn't a decision. It's a synchronization of nervous systems pretending to be poetry. And yet, knowing that doesn't make love meaningless. It makes it miraculous. Because in a universe where atoms follow physics, how extraordinary that chemistry can bloom into something that feels like destiny. The illusion of will is not just a trick, it's the soul's way of participating in inevitability. Philosophers have wrestled with this paradox for centuries. Spinoza saw freedom not as the absence of necessity, but as the recognition of it. To understand the forces that move you is to move with them more gracefully. You're no longer fighting the current, you're learning to surf it. That's why self-knowledge doesn't destroy choice, it refines it. You can't stop the unconscious from initiating, but you can learn to meet it consciously. And that's where mindfulness, not in the trendy sense, but in its raw philosophical form, becomes a kind of rebellion. It's not about emptying the mind, it's about seeing the mind's machinery in motion. When you watch your thoughts arise without instantly claiming them, something subtle shifts. You start to notice that the thought, I should do this, is just another electrical ripple. The emotion, I can't stand this, is just another surge. And when you see them as patterns rather than commands, they start to lose their grip. It's the difference between being on the stage and sitting in the audience. You can still appreciate the drama, but you're not trapped in it. And in that awareness, an unusual kind of choice emerges. Not the choice to control, but the choice to allow. The choice to let reality unfold without the constant strain of authorship. That's not passive, it's deeply alive. It's participation without possession. There's a calm that grows out of that. the kind of calm that doesn't depend on outcomes. You begin to see that your thoughts, emotions, and decisions are waves on the same ocean. The wave doesn't control its form, but it can learn to recognize the tide. And the moment it does, it stops crashing in confusion. It starts flowing in rhythm. So, if free will is an illusion, it's an illusion with purpose. It keeps the play running. It gives consciousness something to do while the universe hums underneath. But maybe the trick isn't to destroy the illusion. It's to see it, respect it, and dance with it. To live as if you choose, even while knowing that the chooser is a ghost made of neurons and stories and starlight. And when you let that paradox settle into you, something quiet happens. The anxiety of getting it right fades. The guilt of messing it up dissolves. You're not failing at being in control. You're awakening to the fact that control was never the point. The point was to witness, to participate, to be a conscious curve in a vast unfolding. That realization isn't cold or mechanical. It's warm. It's oddly intimate. Because when you stop trying to own your choices, you start to feel part of something immeasurably larger. A flow of life that's been moving long before you began. And in that awareness, every breath, every heartbeat, every hesitation becomes less of a test and more of a gift. So as you sit with that, the idea that your will might be scripted, but your awareness is not, notice the ease that comes with it. You can rest in the rhythm of inevitability and still marvel at its beauty. Because the truth isn't that you don't choose, it's that you are the choosing. The universe deciding, through you, to be aware of itself. When freedom feels like chains. As we transition from the machinery of choice into a deeper understanding of how decisions shape our perception of freedom, it becomes clear that having too many options can feel paradoxically like having no choice at all. Think about the last time you stood in front of a menu with dozens of dishes, or scrolled through a streaming platform trying to pick a single movie. The abundance of possibilities, instead of liberating, can create tension, hesitation, and subtle unease. The mind craves resolution, clarity, and structure. Yet, when flooded with alternatives, it is caught in a continuous loop of evaluation, comparison, and self-doubt. This experience, though trivial on the surface, mirrors the greater psychological patterns that govern our lives. Freedom, as humans understand it, is often measured by the ability to choose. Yet the very act of choosing can ignite a deep-seated anxiety, sometimes without conscious awareness. It's as though each choice carries a silent weight, a responsibility that our mind cannot escape. Every path we take implies the paths we do not. And in recognizing this, the mind begins to imagine countless what-ifs, each whispering a tiny accusation. Did you make the right decision? Could you have done better? The psychology behind this phenomenon has a name: choice overload. Studies have shown that when people are presented with an excess of options, satisfaction paradoxically decreases, and stress increases. Our minds, wired for survival, are not designed to navigate infinite possibilities. Instead, they thrive on constraints, patterns, and the simplification of complex realities. The more freedom we perceive, the more the subconscious feels imprisoned by the weight of its own expectations. Now, consider how this manifests in relationships, in careers, in personal ambitions. You may feel a persistent tug toward the idea that if you just choose differently, a different friend, a different job, a different romantic partner. Your life would align more perfectly with some imagined ideal. Yet, as you pursue this ideal through each decision, the freedom you sought as liberation subtly mutates into an invisible cage. The mind begins to crave certainty, to yearn for a framework that provides guidance, structure, and reassurance. The paradox is clear. Freedom, in its raw form, can become a psychological burden, shaping behavior in ways that feel compelling but subtly oppressive. The mind's response to this paradox is fascinating. When confronted with too many choices, it can develop coping mechanisms that range from avoidance to obsessive analysis. Some individuals freeze, unable to act, while others compulsively seek more information, endlessly evaluating and reevaluating each potential decision. In both cases, the supposed freedom is eclipsed by mental loops that drain energy and clarity. The very autonomy we chase, the agency we hold so dearly, can become a source of internal friction, quietly undermining peace of mind and emotional balance. In the context of love and relationships, this paradox is magnified. Romantic choices are among the most emotionally charged, and the stakes feel high because they intertwine with identity, social perception, and longing for connection. The presence of multiple potential partners or lifestyles can intensify doubt, comparison, and what psychologists call anticipatory regret. Here, freedom is not liberating, it is exacting. It forces the mind to weigh imagined consequences against fleeting emotional impulses, often leading to a subtle but persistent dissatisfaction with whatever choice is made. Every moment of hesitation carries the weight of imagined outcomes, every decision tinged with the ghost of possibility. However, there is an overlooked benefit in understanding this dynamic. Awareness of the paradox itself can liberate. Recognizing that the stress, indecision, or anxiety you feel is not a failure of character, but a natural product of the structure of human cognition, allows a form of acceptance to emerge. You can begin to disentangle the pressure of endless alternatives from the inherent joy of action and presence. By acknowledging the limits of choice, you also reclaim the ability to focus on what truly matters, rather than being distracted by every potential path that your mind conjures. Moreover, this understanding connects deeply with philosophical reflection. The illusion of freedom is not merely a psychological trick. It is also a philosophical conundrum that humans have wrestled with for centuries. What does it mean to choose? Does freedom lie in the number of options, or in the quality of presence within a single path? Stoic philosophers, for instance, would argue that true liberty comes not from multiplying possibilities, but from mastering oneself, from cultivating wisdom, discernment, and inner calm. Similarly, contemporary psychology suggests that when we constrain our environment, set boundaries, and cultivate intentional limitations, our perceived freedom actually increases, and the mind relaxes. As we explore this paradox, imagine the invisible chains that lie beneath your daily choices, and also the potential to dissolve them. Each decision is not merely an external action, it is a reflection of attention, values, and awareness. When you choose with mindfulness rather than compulsion, with intention rather than distraction, the oppressive weight of freedom begins to lift. The mind, once entrapped by limitless possibilities, can begin to rest in the clarity of present engagement. Choices are no longer burdens. They become instruments of self-realization, opportunities to exercise attention, discernment, and creativity. To navigate this effectively, subtle strategies emerge. One approach is called preference simplification, identifying core values and aligning decisions with these fundamental principles rather than endlessly evaluating peripheral possibilities. Another is the practice of micro-decisions, breaking complex choices into smaller, manageable steps that reduce cognitive overload. And yet, even these strategies are not about exerting more control. They are about noticing the inherent patterns that govern mental life and choosing to work with them rather than being victim to them. Finally, consider the deeper lesson of this paradox. The illusion of unlimited choice is intertwined with the perception of self. The ego thrives on alternatives, on the possibility that one could be differently, elsewhere, or otherwise. Yet, awareness allows us to disentangle identity from options. There's also a deeper emotional layer to this. Control is often a mask for fear. The mind clings because it's terrified of uncertainty, of the void that exists when outcomes can't be predicted. But the paradox is that life's most profound moments, falling in love, inspiration, transformation, all arise from that same uncertainty. You can't schedule insight. You can't force love. You can't command peace. You can only create the conditions for them to arise naturally. Surrender is the art of creating those conditions. Philosophically, thinkers from Nietzsche to Alan Watts have danced around this paradox. Watts famously said, "To have faith is to trust yourself to the water. When you swim, you don't grab hold of the water, because if you do, you'll sink and drown. Instead, you relax and float." This metaphor captures the essence of psychological surrender. It's not about doing nothing. It's about ceasing the futile struggle against what already carries you. So, how does one begin to practice surrender in daily life? It starts with awareness, noticing the small moments where resistance arises, the traffic jam that triggers anger, the plan that falls apart, the silence that feels uncomfortable. These are invitations to release control, to breathe, and to see what remains when you stop clinging. At first, the mind will panic. It's conditioned to equate control with safety. But over time, as you repeatedly let go and realize the world doesn't collapse, trust begins to grow. That trust is the foundation of inner freedom. The real mastery of surrender is subtle. It's not about rejecting control, but about choosing where control serves and where it suffocates. You control your actions, your integrity, your effort, but you surrender the outcome. You act fully, but you let go of the need for a guarantee. The paradox resolves itself in that delicate balance. Full engagement without attachment. And maybe, just maybe, surrender is not the opposite of strength, but its highest expression. To surrender means to face reality as it is, unfiltered, unbent by desire. That level of acceptance requires immense courage. Control hides fear. Surrender reveals trust. In that trust, the mind finds peace not through dominance, but through harmony. As you sit with that thought, notice how it feels in your own life. Where are you fighting what's already unfolding? Where could letting go lead to greater clarity? Sometimes, surrender doesn't change the situation at all. It changes you. And when you change, everything else starts to move differently. Almost as if the universe had been waiting for you to release your grip so it could finally breathe with you. You realize that not knowing is not the enemy. It's the open space where everything new is born. There's a subtle beauty to living from that understanding. You start responding instead of reacting. You begin to listen before judging, to observe before assuming. You still strive, you still build, you still dream. But the striving is cleaner, lighter, no longer poisoned by the belief that peace lies at the finish line. You find yourself at peace in the process itself. It's here that acceptance becomes indistinguishable from wisdom. Because wisdom isn't about having all the answers. It's about knowing which questions no longer need to be asked. It's about realizing that some doors close not because you failed to open them, but because they were never meant for you. It's about meeting endings with gratitude instead of bitterness, and beginnings with curiosity instead of fear. Acceptance transforms life into a continuous act of trust, not in fate or luck, but in your own capacity to meet whatever comes. And maybe that's where the real freedom hides, not in escaping uncertainty, but in making peace with it, not in changing the world before you can breathe, but in breathing even while the world shifts around you. Acceptance gives you back the quiet confidence that you can live this moment fully, fearlessly, completely, without needing it to be any different first. So, when we talk about the freedom of acceptance, what we're really describing is the art of alignment, the point where inner resistance ends and presence begins. It's not the loud kind of liberation that announces itself. It's the quiet revolution that happens when you stop running, when you finally stop negotiating with reality and start collaborating with it. In that collaboration, life stops being something to conquer and becomes something to participate in. And that's where peace begins. Not as an external achievement, but as the silent recognition that nothing more needs to be fixed before you can be whole. You already are. The freedom of acceptance, the quiet revolution. Within. As we reach this final layer of the journey, everything we've explored, control, surrender, awareness, begins to converge into one central idea: acceptance. But not the passive kind of acceptance that feels like resignation. I'm talking about the active, deliberate form. The kind that opened the mind instead of closing it. The kind that says, "This is what is, and I will meet it fully." It's not a retreat from life, but a deeper participation in it. Acceptance doesn't dull experience, it clarifies it. It removes the haze of resistance that makes everything harder than it needs to be. To accept something doesn't mean to like it. It simply means to stop fighting its existence. You can't truly move forward while you're still wishing reality were different. Acceptance is the bridge between chaos and clarity, the space where perspective returns. And strangely, it's only when you stop demanding that life obey your conditions that transformation actually begins. You stop pouring energy into control, and that energy becomes available for creation, for healing, for movement. Think of acceptance as a kind of psychological gravity. It grounds you in the now, in what's actually happening, not in what you think should be happening. The human mind spends most of its time elsewhere, rehashing what went wrong or rehearsing what could go wrong next. That constant loop steals presence, and without presence, there's no peace. Acceptance anchors awareness in this exact moment, and when you're fully here, the future doesn't disappear. It just stops being a threat. It's almost revolutionary to accept life in a world built on constant dissatisfaction. Society sells progress as escape, a promise that you'll finally feel okay once you achieve, buy, fix, improve. Acceptance breaks that loop. It whispers the radical truth that you are already enough in this moment, even as you change. That's not stagnation, it's liberation. Because when you no longer act out of lack, you begin to act out of authenticity. Every step becomes an expression of who you are, not a desperate attempt to become someone else. This is the deeper irony of acceptance. It doesn't trap you where you are. It frees you to move forward without self-rejection. When you accept your fear, you can face it. When you accept your anger, you can understand it. When you accept your imperfection, you open space for growth. Resistance freezes evolution, but acceptance releases it. It turns conflict into dialogue, emotion into signal, limitation into teacher. The world doesn't suddenly change when you accept it. You change, and that changes how the world meets you. In neuroscience, this dynamic mirrors the mechanism of cognitive reframing. The moment you shift from "this shouldn't be happening" to "this is happening," the brain's threat response begins to calm. The amygdala quiets, and prefrontal reasoning returns. You literally think more clearly when you stop fighting what's real. From that clarity, solutions that were invisible in panic become obvious. That's why acceptance isn't weakness. It's the prerequisite for intelligent action. Acceptance also dissolves the ego's need for control because it recognizes that uncertainty isn't an error in the system, it is the system. Life, by design, is fluid, ever-changing, unpredictable, alive. The attempt to make it rigid only breeds suffering, but once you see uncertainty as an essential feature of existence rather than a flaw, something within relaxes. And now it's up to you. So, after all this, maybe you're sitting there in silence, maybe with a strange calm that wasn't there when we started. That's good, because silence isn't emptiness, it's space. Space for something new to take root. We've walked through illusion, control, choice, surrender, and acceptance. All these layers that shape what it means to be human. And maybe somewhere in all that noise, you felt something resonate, something small but real. Hold on to that. Because understanding doesn't come in a single moment. It unfolds quietly every time you dare to see your life from a different angle. The truth is, none of us completely escape the illusions. We just learn to see them more clearly. That's the real progress. Not perfection, but awareness. The ability to notice when your mind is trying to build cages out of fear, and to gently step outside instead of fighting the bars. That's freedom in its simplest form. The freedom to see. And if there's one thing I hope you take from this, it's that awareness doesn't have to make life heavier. It can make it lighter. You don't have to control everything to live fully. You don't have to know everything to move forward. You don't have to be fearless to be free. You just have to keep showing up, consciously, honestly, imperfectly. So, take a breath. Let it all settle. And as you go back into your world, the noise, the people, the movement, remember that stillness doesn't live in isolation. It lives in you. You can carry it anywhere. If this video gave you something, a thought, a pause, a small shift, then maybe share it with someone who might need that pause too. Not because it solves anything, but because sometimes a few quiet minutes of reflection can start a chain reaction. Thank you for being here, for listening, for thinking, for feeling. You could have spent these minutes anywhere, but you spent them here, and that means something. Until next time, take care of your mind, stay curious, and remember, you're already freer than you think.